Southeastern Massachusetts, the 1970s. A 200-mile patch of land encompassing numerous towns is dubbed one of the most mysterious and active paranormal vortexes in the country. It has seen the likes of ghosts, UFO sightings, sightings of monsters and creatures, and glowing balls of light that defy explanation. Cryptozoologist Loren Coleman documented this area in the 1970s and 1980s, and he gave it a name: the Bridgewater Triangle. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I'm your host, Dominic, and I want to thank you for tuning into this week's episode on the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, I know in the intro I gave you a little backstory as to where the Bridgewater Triangle is. Now, this whole area is in Southeastern Massachusetts, and it encompasses the numerous towns. But when Loren Coleman was documenting this area in the 1970s and 1980s, he determined that the supposed triangle, the 3 points of the triangle, were the towns of Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown. And I will have a picture on my Instagram as to where the points of the triangle are and where the towns are in comparison to each other, so you have a better understanding of how much area that this triangle takes up. Now, before I get into the events and reports that have happened in this area, I think it's very important that we go over some history of this area. And as you'll see, and I think that you'll come to agree with me, that the history of this area is extremely important to the overall story. Now, our first important date in the whole story of this region of New England is in 1675. Specifically in 1675, King Philip's War. Now, during this time period, there were rising conflicts between the Native American tribes of the region and the English settlers. Now, Metacomet, aka King Philip, who changed his name, Metacomet was the leader of a chief of the Wampanoag Native Americans. Now, Metacomet took charge of the Wampanoag after his father died in 1662, and at this time, tensions were already going sour between the settlers and the nearby Narragansett tribe. Now, the Narragansett tribe were home in Rhode Island, and there was already disputes going on between the Narragansett and the colonists. Now, the Narragansett had land disputes, and the Wampanoag kind of got into these land disputes, and they become increasingly aggressive and sour for the past 55 years between the Native Americans and between the colonists. Now, what kick-started the war between Metacomet's Wampanoag and the English settlers was the execution of 3 of Metacomet's warriors, who were found guilty by the colonists for killing John Sassaman, a settler and Harvard graduate who was found guilty, who had converted to Native American practices. So this John Sassaman had converted to Native American practices, and he had acted somewhat as an advisor to Metacomet's tribe. However, Metacomet accused him of spying on the Wampanoag and ousted him. And because of that, obviously, because he was ousted from the tribe, Metacomet thought he was spying. So Metacomet's warriors took it upon themselves to go and kill John Sassaman. So these 3 Wampanoag warriors killed John Sassaman. Colonists found out, obviously looked at this as 3 Wampanoag who decided to take it into their own actions to kill this man, and obviously that is murder in the colonists' eyes, and executed all 3 of Metacomet's warriors. Now, this kick-started the war, and this got Metacomet very involved in the war. And over the next 6 months, colonial raiding parties and the Native Americans would engage in battles in modern-day Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and even coastal Maine. Now, during this time frame, the Narragansett Indians were trying to stay neutral, as this was not their fight to be involved in. This was between the Wampanoag and the colonists. This was not between the Narragansetts. They did not feel like this involved them. However, individual members of the Narragansett tribe decided to take off and stage their own battles against the colonists, which was obviously frowned upon by the Narragansett tribe. This made the colonists very angry, as they viewed all of the Narragansetts now in violation of the peace treaties they had both signed, and viewed them, the Narragansetts, as well as Metacomet's Wampanoag, as enemies to the colonists. Now, this kind of got the Narragansetts involved, and it was kind of the idea that a few bad apples ruined the bunch. A few Narragansetts decided to strike it out on their own because they did not like the colonists, and that in turn got the entire Narragansetts into the war. Now, in December of 1675, the governor of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, Josiah Winslow, organized a colonial militia to march against the Narragansetts' fort in Rhode Island. And eventually, the Narragansetts suffered huge losses when the colonists came in, both from a warrior standpoint and also the colonists burned the fort to the ground. And this caused many elder Native Americans and women of the tribe to be burned to death. And obviously, that is something we look back on in history as a very dark time in history when things like that happen. But obviously, it did happen. King Philip and other Native Americans who were inside the Narragansett fort fled. And they fled into the swampy marshland on the Rhode Island-Massachusetts border. And obviously, this being December in New England, many of the Native Americans that fled from the fort died immediately due to exposure. Now, King Philip, Metacomet, eventually fled to Mount Hope, Rhode Island, where he had a secret headquarters. Now, eventually, he was caught and assassinated at Mount Hope, and his head was put on a pike and displayed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which is pretty morbid. But back to the Triangle area. Also during this time, Wampanoag Chief Onawan, who served under King Philip's dad, Massahoit, and later King Philip, aka Metacomet. And I just want to say, if I get any of these names wrong or I pronounce them wrong, I do want to apologize. It's not my intention. I think I'm saying them all right, but obviously, I just want to put that disclaimer out there that if I say any of these names wrong, I do apologize. Now, after the death of King Philip, Metacomet, Onawan became the new sachem, or aka the leader of the Wampanoag. Now, Onawan, when he was under King Philip, led the war efforts against the Plymouth colony, and he was eventually tracked down by Captain Benjamin Church 2 weeks after the death of King Philip, and was captured at Onawan Rock. Now, keep this location of Onawan Rock in the back of your brain for a second, because this place will come back later. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Now, Onawan was captured, brought to Plymouth, and executed. Now, during this area and around Onawan Rock, because now we're back in Massachusetts, we're not in Rhode Island anymore, we're back in Massachusetts. Now, the Hockomock Swamp, which sits smack dab in the center of the Bridgewater Triangle, was a focal point of this whole conflict. And it was a focal point in the entirety of King Philip's War, because during this time it was used as a Native American stronghold, as well as later it was a Native American burial ground. And the Wampanoag had a name for this area, and it loosely translates to the place where spirits dwell. Now, again, kind of keep that in the back of your mind as well, because the Hockomock Swamp will come back into the story. Now, that little history session kind of shines light on the bloody history of this area, and it seems like this area in whole contains numerous hotspots of activity, which, through tracking some down, I found a number of hotspots that are in this area of the Bridgewater Triangle. So, the first hotspot of activity is obviously Onawan Rock, which we talked about. Now, Onawan Rock, many people who go and visit Onawan Rock report paranormal activity and report seeing a ghostly apparition who many think is Chief Onawan at Onawan Rock. Another hotspot is Profile Rock. Now, this is another historical site where during King Philip's War, King Philip gave Chief Onawan a wampum belt. So this was pretty much a token and a cherished item to the Wampanoag. Now, this is significant because hikers and people who visit the rock have reported seeing a ghost of a man on top of Profile Rock with his legs crossed and his arms outstretched. So if this, whether or not this is the ghost of King Philip, or maybe this is the ghost of Chief Anawan, or whoever it might be, people also report paranormal activity at Profile Rock. Now, another hotspot is the Freetown Fall River State Forest. And now the Freetown Fall River State Forest, its history of a hotspot really comes in the 1900s. Now, the Freetown Fall River State Forest has reportedly been the site of cult and satanic activity, such as ritual sacrifice through animal mutilations and murders. It has also been the site of numerous suicides. And kind of a disclaimer on what I'm going to talk about next. Obviously, a little disclaimer. In 1978, the corpse of Mary Lou Aruda was found tied to a tree in the woods. She was a 15-year-old who was abducted and murdered in the woods. And later in the 1980s, police were investigating a murder in the woods and were approached by locals claiming to have witnessed satanic cult activity in the woods. And it is very possible that these reports were connected to the Fall River cult killings. Now, if you want to do some research on the Fall River cult killings, go right ahead and do so. There were 3 murders during the 1980s that were very much connected to cult activity, and that was pretty much a proven fact. So not only do you have this area as a whole witnessing a lot of death from the King Philip's War, you also have it witnessing death in the present day, in some very evil and diabolical ways. Now, clearings full of cattle carcasses were also found in the woods, and that confirmed the rumors of animal mutilations in the forest from cult and satanic activity. Now, people have reported seeing everything from UFOs, ghosts, mysterious orbs of light, giant snakes, and even unexplained disappearances in the Freetown Fall River State Forest. And just a little kind of nugget for all of you folks, even President Ronald Reagan reported seeing strange lights in this forest. Now, to cap this whole hotspot off, older legends of this forest also speak of pukwudgies, a type of humanoid creature of Wampanoag folklore that lives in the woods, and I will go a little bit into pukwudgies a little bit later. Now, our next hotspot is Hockomock Swamp. Now, this burial ground has been home to numerous sightings of Bigfoot, as well as reported sightings of the Thunderbird. And if any of you have not heard of the Thunderbird before, this is another creature of Native American folklore that is described as a massive, almost prehistoric-looking bird with a wingspan between 8 to 12 feet long. And if you decide to venture into the swamp, be prepared that the cell service is very spotty, the GPS systems get very glitchy, and it's very easy to get lost in the swamp as it is so large and so dense and vast. Another hotspot is the Taunton State Hospital. Now, the Taunton State Hospital, formerly known as the Taunton Lunatic Asylum, is another location in the Triangle that was plagued by cult activity and murders in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, during its time of operation, the Taunton State Hospital also housed a few serial killers during its duration of being open, and it has been the site of more paranormal activities such as disembodied screams, sounds of people crying when there's no one there, and even people reportedly being stopped in their tracks by an unknown force when trying to enter the basement of the Taunton State Hospital, as well as sightings of mysterious orbs of light that people cannot explain. Now, the last little hotspot is Route 44, U.S. Route 44, that runs kind of in the Triangle. Obviously, U.S. Route 44 starts in Massachusetts and ends in New York, but there's a little stretch that passes through the Triangle. Now, travelers down U.S. Route 44 that crosses into the Bridgewater Triangle have reportedly seen sightings of a ghostly apparition of a hitchhiker, and that being a red-headed hitchhiker with a bushy red beard. And this first story was made famous in the book The New England Ghost Files. And however, the tales of them seeing the red-headed hitchhiker go back a lot farther than the publication of this book. But it tells people encountering this ghost in a red flannel, dirty jeans, boots, and a long bushy red beard. Most of the travelers speak of the same thing, matching descriptions of what the apparition is wearing, and have even told stories of, and been stories that people who are good Samaritans enough to pick up the hitchhiker, obviously he's a ghost, but people see him on the side of the road, so they feel like he's a hitchhiker who is looking for a ride, and obviously this ghost or apparition is able to manifest himself in a way that makes him seen by the public on a consistent basis. So people who are good Samaritans enough to pick him up say he will go into the back seat, even though if there's nobody sitting in the passenger seat, he will automatically go in the back seat. He will not speak. He will give no response to where he is going and just point down the road when he is prompted to where he's going. And eventually he will start to giggle, and this slowly turns to a loud laughter. And then people obviously, for some reason, they think that this strange man hitchhiker is just laughing in their car. Obviously, they're like, okay, cut it out. You're not really explaining yourself. Then obviously when they say that or they pull over to kick the guy out of their car, he is gone. And he has totally disappeared from people's vehicles, and it's like he has disappeared into thin air. Now, many speculate where this ghost first appeared or how he came to haunt this particular stretch of road. But to me, it seems like one thing is for certain, and that it seems like this ghost wants to be seen and has no problem leaving lasting impressions on those who encounter him. Now, obviously, I mentioned that the whole Bridgewater Triangle as a whole has also been a hotbed of UFO activity. Now, I kind of want to go into reports of UFOs that have fallen within the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, the first sighting is 1760, and according to an article I read, they said that this was the quote-unquote first documented sighting of a UFO in the world. This was the first one over the Bridgewater Triangle, but I kind of debunked the date on the first documented sighting, as the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1639 were the first time that they reported basically strange lights, because at that time, the concept of a UFO didn't exist, but they documented that they saw strange lights over the Massachusetts Bay Colony during 1639, and then again in 1644. So 1639, 1644, not 1760. 1760 is probably the date where it was the first one specifically over the Bridgewater Triangle, but I mean, again, I was very skeptical about the quote-unquote first documented sighting, so I did some more research into that. And then in 1908, local papers in the Bridgewater Triangle report on another UFO sighting. And then 60 years later, in 1968, many witnesses reported seeing a large orb floating in between trees around Rehoboth. And then in 1976, multiple witnesses reportedly see two UFOs traveling along U.S. Route 44 through Taunton. Then in 1994, a police officer reports to have seen a UFO in the town of Raynham. Now, those are loose dates that I found through multiple articles. There's probably a whole lot more that were not documented or people did not come forth. So obviously these were the ones that were documented and that I could find. That being said, that kind of brings us into sightings of unexplained creatures in the Triangle. And the reason I'm kind of going through every little bit of this is just to cover the vast array of basically phenomenon that are occurring in this 200-mile area. So I'm going to start the sightings of unexplained creatures with obviously one that everybody knows, and that being Bigfoot. Obviously, everybody has probably heard of Bigfoot and at one point or another, and obviously, according to people, he's no stranger to this area either. Now, from what I found, a first documented report from the Bridgewater Triangle about Bigfoot came from 1970. Police had reports coming in of a hairy creature running through the backyards of residents within the triangle. Local and state police investigated, but had no luck tracking down whatever this was. Then in 1978, Joseph de Andrade witnessed a Bigfoot coming down a hill about 200 feet in front of him, and then later also had a second encounter when camping with some friends. Then in 1980, John Baker of West Bridgewater, Massachusetts, saw the creature when he was out hunting in the swamp. Now, I wanted to do some more digging into this and digging into the area as a whole, and I came upon a podcast done by Unsolved Mysteries. If you've never heard of Unsolved Mysteries, definitely check it out. Obviously, Unsolved Mysteries was on television for a very long time. They rebooted it on Netflix. I don't know if they're doing any more seasons, but Unsolved Mysteries did a podcast episode on the Hockomock Swamp, and listening to it, there is a sighting of something like Bigfoot, but it seems very interesting in its own regard. So the sighting is by Fanny Manzella, and it's about 4 minutes or so, and I'm just going to play it for you and just kind of listen. And I know it's 4 minutes, so it's a little bit longer, but I felt like it's very important to play this whole sighting and this whole story out.
It isn't until she's an adult that Fanny has a personal encounter with a strange creature lurking in this ominous swampland. Late one afternoon, Fanny is home with her parents when she decides to go out for a jog on her usual running path that takes her through dense woods and past the nearby cemetery.
It was last spring. The day was misty. I mean, not misty like I couldn't see through it, but it was odd and eerie. It was a damp, overcast, chilly afternoon, and just the whole energy of the woods and everything around me just felt frightening and unsettling. I went for a run, probably for about an hour, and it's when I was on my way back home that I saw this. The house I grew up in and the cemetery where I saw this and where all this happened happens to be at the bottom of like a fairly steep hill. So I was coming down the street, and it's like a wooded street. There's some houses up the street from where we live, but in the area where I saw this, it happens to be densely wooded. There aren't any developments or homes nearby. There's a cemetery set back in the woods. The tombstones are still fully visible from the street. It's maybe 15 yards or so up a little wooded path, the cemetery, and I always just unconsciously look at the cemetery every time I pass it, whether I'm driving past it, walking past it, running past it, whatever. I'm just always looking. So on my way back from this run, heading down the hill, I glanced over and looked up the path, and I saw what I saw, which was incredibly alarming and very frightening. I described it as like an ogre. I would say it was at least like 15 feet tall, so nowhere near the size or structure of a human being. And this creature was 100% at the entry of this gated cemetery, obscuring the view into the cemetery. Like I really couldn't even see any of the tombstones because it was right there blocking the entry of the cemetery. Incredibly huge, covered in hair, kind of reddish or like warm toned, like orangish reddish fur. The face, I can tell you, was not hairy. It was the only part of the creature that wasn't covered in hair, as far as I could see. The rest of the animal was hairy, but like stringy, like wiry hair, not like a luxuriant animal coat. It clearly had arms, legs. It was on 2 feet like a person would be. Clearly not a person. Broad-chested, broad-shouldered. It was definitely close enough that I could 100% say it wasn't a stump or a bear or a tree. It couldn't have been a moose or anything like, not that moose even live here, but it couldn't have been anything like that. And there was no mistaking what it was that I was seeing. I mean, it was clearly some sort of monster of some sort. I had an immediate response to it. I was immediately terrified, filled with dread, and it was facing me, facing the road. I could see its face, but I couldn't make its features out, but I felt that it had seen me, and I did not want to be there any longer. It was a scary, bad feeling. And I felt like that's part of what makes it what it was. I felt like I was at threat of being attacked or chased. I could see.
Now, that's just kind of a little 4-minute snippet of that podcast done by Unsolved Mysteries. And I felt like it was very interesting, and that's why I decided to include it in the episode. Obviously, there's a lot of things that are talked about in there that lines up with, obviously, reports of Bigfoot. Obviously, she doesn't call it Bigfoot. To her, it looked more like an ogre. So, obviously, to me, that obviously, everything that she described screams of Bigfoot to me. Obviously, the height is a little bit of a question mark because that 15 feet is pretty much out of the realm of possibility as what Bigfoot has reported. I mean, I'm not saying that can't be true, but 15 feet seems a little bit too tall for Bigfoot, obviously, because they say the sightings are more in the range of 8 to 9 feet tall. 15 feet, I mean, it could be just, glance sighting. You look at something and it's, you're shooting from the hip and saying, oh, it's 15 feet tall. But nonetheless, I'm not going to criticize this sighting, but I felt like it was very important and very interesting. And obviously they added all their mysterious sound effects in there and made it more spooky than how she was telling the story, obviously. But I felt like it was important to play for y'all and to listen and kind of hear that and hear somebody else's voice other than mine, obviously. But the next creature I want to go into, I'm going to transition away from Bigfoot, and I want to get into the Thunderbird. Now, there's 2 accounts that I found that kind of stood out to me when it came to the Thunderbird. Obviously, I was very skeptical of the Thunderbird anyway, just because obviously you run into that thing or theory that something that large should be found by now. You should see it. But then yet again, there was 2 accounts that stood out to me. So the first one being in 1971 with Norton Police Sergeant Thomas Downey. Now, Thomas Downey was driving home through Marshfield, Massachusetts, and saw a creature standing on the edge of the swamp. Now, he described this creature as bird-like, standing 6 feet tall, with a wingspan of 8 to 12 feet in length. Now, when the creature saw Downey in his car, it moved towards his vehicle and then flew off in the air. Now, when police arrived to investigate Sergeant Downey's claim, they found giant 3-toed footprints left in the area of where the creature was seen. Now, moving on to the second encounter. In 1988, 2 boys followed what they described as large 3-toed footprints into the swamp and came across a creature that was very similar to Downey's recollection of the creature. Bird-like, with a massive wingspan, with almost some human characteristics. The kids saw this creature and took off, and so did the creature itself. They returned home frightened and told their parents and police, and the police and their parents just totally discredited the story and said the boys saw a larger than average great blue heron. Now, I couldn't find a location of where this sighting took place or the name of either of the boys involved, so that's kind of a question mark in that regard, but it doesn't shock me that their parents and the police kind of discredited this incident entirely. Your 2 boys going to the swamp, they say they see a giant a giant bird, frankly, and they're just like, oh, well, it is a great blue heron, because you don't see great blue herons all the time. So it's like, oh, that's a great blue heron. That's just big. And it's like, I don't really buy that, because if you see a heron or a crane or, whatever, you can kind of tell that that's a bird. Like, that's not like something that doesn't make sense to you. So again, question marks on that, but I think the boys actually saw something. I feel like that's too, again, I'm often left scratching my head because it's like, I want to believe it, but then on the same page, it's like, well, should I? Like, because there's no location, there's no names, so it's, again, I'm often flip-flopping between what I believe. And lastly, puckwudgies. Now, puckwudgies are kind of like little trolls or people of the woods, and their powers and abilities kind of vary from the Native American tribes, but they are often described as tricksters who are very threatened by humans and threatened by human presence. Now, the history of puckwudgies goes way back in Native American folklore, so it's often like the Thunderbird. Now, is that believable? Well, I guess, again, you're asking yourself the question, what's believable and what's not believable? I mean, I'm honestly more apt to believe that there's a giant bird out there than a little troll or little person that lives in the woods who are sneaky little tricksters who are often said to attack humans. So, again, puckwudgies, I think maybe that's something that I can do a episode on in entirety to learn more about puckwudgies, and maybe you're not if I buy the existence of puckwudgies. Now, that being said, that kind of summarizes all the information and all the digging that I went through to find all this, and I did a lot of digging because I wanted to find the full story and the full ensemble of everything that was going on in this area, because I felt like it was important to share. Now, usually I end this off with a theory section. Now, this is kind of very hard to end it off with the theory section because there's so much going on that you kind of have to break it up into what I think is real and what I think may be a little bit of a stretch of the truth. Now, the first kind of theory or thought of mine is that a big chunk of these areas encounters are real and genuine. Now, I think a huge chunk of the paranormal claims are real. I'm a big believer in the paranormal, and I think this area has seen way too much death to not have a spiritual attachment of some sort. I think Onawan Rock, Profile Rock, the Freetown Fall River State Forest, and the Taunton State Hospital are massive paranormal hotspots. Now, does that mean I think that the claims of UFO sightings and, monsters or creatures are real in this triangle? Yes and no. I think when you get into the realm of UFOs, I often find them more credible than a sighting of a creature of some sort, especially during the 1900s and the 1970s and everything like that. Obviously, UFOs were not as mainstream as they are now, and I'm pretty sure I said that before in my Gulf Breeze UFO incident episode. UFOs are very mainstream now, whereas back then, you saw something, it's like, nope, this is the way it is. You don't challenge the way that, the world is. That does not exist. So I think I often find UFO reports more credible from the 1900s because it's not mainstream. Why would somebody be making it up? But then yet again, people make up things for all kinds of reasons, so I can't even begin to imagine why somebody would make something up. But that again. When it comes to the creatures, I think maybe some of these sightings could be capturing on like a craze, such as the Bigfoot sightings or even sightings of the Thunderbird. I think the puckwudgie thing is completely of itself. And obviously I said that people said that they reported seeing giant snakes, and I couldn't find that anywhere. Like some articles said, sightings of giant snakes, but I couldn't find any articles that had specific okay, this person saw it in this year and this is how they described it. Like, I couldn't find that. So the claim of giant snakes, I think, is very, like, take that with a grain of salt, because I don't really buy that, because I couldn't find any sightings of that. Like, I couldn't find any, written down reports of, okay, I saw a giant snake in the Hockomock Swamp. Like, I couldn't find any of that. So again, maybe that was just because of where I was digging, or maybe I was digging in the wrong spot, or wherever it might be. I'm not sure. But do I think that, do I think some of the Bigfoot sightings are genuine? Yes. But do I think it's kind of also odd that, it seems like a lot of these, obviously it seems like there's a spike in the 1970s, and that gets the attention of, obviously, cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, who comes down and then documents the area. So kind of what prompted the spike in activity in the 1970s and the 1980s that kind of kickstarted everybody's recognition of this area being like, okay, this is a paranormal vortex? I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of questions about this area that are going to remain unanswered for a very long time. And it's just one of those things. I think that as a whole, I think this area is very, very mysterious. And it's something that we should, as a society and as people who believe in the paranormal or believe in cryptids or believe in any of this stuff, should put a lens on it and really focus on it and say, okay, what is going on here? This deserves more attention. And I think it does. I think it deserves a lot more attention than what is given to it. I think it's just kind of like, okay, this place is here, stuff just happens. I don't think we should take that as an answer. We shouldn't take, okay, stuff just happens here as the answer. I think we should really dig in and investigate what is the reason that this area is experiencing the activity that it is, and I think that's important. But as a whole, I think a lot of this area is genuine. I think a lot of the claims and sightings are genuine. Like I said, I think that, I think people like to kind of separate it and say, okay, well, all of the Native American history happened then, this is happening now. I think they're directly related. I think that you don't have an area that has experienced as much turmoil and as much death, even through the 1600s and King Philip's War, and then later in the 1900s with the satanic and cult murders and things like that. Like, you don't have an area that has experienced that much death, and you don't have some sort of paranormal activity. So, in conclusion, I think this area is a legit paranormal vortex and hotbed of activity. I think the proof is in everything. The proof is in the pudding, and the proof is in everything that has been seen and reported, as well as the history of this place. I just think that there's too much to ignore. You don't have all of these sightings coming in without there being some validity to it. And you don't have the activity still continuing to this day unless there is not validity to it. So, that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode on the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, please let me know how you enjoyed this episode. You can follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown. I will be attaching images about this episode on my Instagram. And you can also go on and subscribe to me on YouTube. It's the second place where I also upload these videos. If you're on YouTube, and if you're listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and give me a follow on Spotify if you have Spotify, and turn on the notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And to wrap it all off, in case you folks did not know, you can send me topic suggestions. I haven't said that in an episode before, but you can send me topic suggestions. Now, how can you do that? You can send me topic suggestions through my email account at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I will say that again, at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can send me topic suggestions. This could be something that you saw yesterday. This could be something that you have personally looked into for 6, 8, 12 months, whatever it may be. Whatever you have, whatever topics you want me to cover, send them over my way. I want to look at all of them, and I want to do topics on everything. And this episode on the Bridgewater Triangle was actually submitted by somebody who gave me a topic suggestion. So this is proof that I will cover your episode suggestions if you send them to me. If you send them to me, I will absolutely cover them, and I will put them in a list with all my other episode ideas, and I'll say, okay, I will specifically get to this one on this specific date, but definitely don't get mad at me if I get to it right away, because I have a lot of episodes that are already written down, that are already in my queue. So, that being said, Follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Go to Spotify. Follow me on Spotify. Turn on notifications. And don't forget to send me episode suggestions on my Gmail at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. That being said, thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. I had a whole lot of fun covering this episode. And that being said, I will see you on the next one.